Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on when and where you're watching this. I've said that once or twice before. I think I may say it a few more times. But welcome to another Festival in a Box 2.0 session. We're very privileged to be joined by Alan Katz of the New York Distilling Co. And he is direct from New York, believe it or not, to talk to us about the Ragtime Rye. So I'm going to bring Alan in now.
Believe it, Eddie. I'm in Brooklyn.
Wow.
I'm here.
Fantastic. Well, it's great to see you. I can't believe I've been in Brooklyn, but not for a few years. But possibly when I was there, I wasn't aware of you guys. So, but next time I'm there, I'll definitely come visit.
I'm glad to say that we're still here. One, thanks for the chance to talk to you today. And we're coming up on 10 years of live production of rye whiskey and gin in Brooklyn, which has been,
wow, fantastic.
All this year aside, really quite a bit of fun.
Yeah, yeah. Well, obviously you can talk to us maybe a bit later about how New York was once a hotbed for particularly rye distillation, and it's now kind of having a bit of a renaissance with you guys and a few others. So, but anyway, Alan, it'd be great to hear a little bit about yourself and how you came to bring this all together to produce this brilliant distillery.
Thanks. It's my pleasure. As I said, well, New York Distilling Company has been here in Brooklyn for almost 10 years. End of 2021, we'll celebrate our 10th anniversary. And for me, on a very personal level, I've just had a tremendous amount of astoundingly good fortune. And I've been in New York City for almost 30 years, and I got into the hospitality industry as a livelihood early on, as many people do. I actually moved to New York to pursue conducting once upon a time, but that was half a life ago. And I still have a great appreciation and enjoyment for music, but for me, making a living turned to restaurant work, bar work, again, a very common tale, and it grabbed me very quickly and very strongly. And I was interested almost immediately in the cultural aspects as much as what we were serving or what was the nuts and bolts of the business part of running a bar or restaurant. And as I made my way, and this was in the 90s and the early aughts, I just sort of had one great fortune followed by another, including some time spent living and working in Northwest Tuscany in Italy at a cooking school there, bartending on 2 different extended occasions, the first of which informs me to this day. I had no particular attention to what we were pulling out of the well to make a cocktail, let alone if the limes were from California or Mexico at a different time of year. We made cocktails to please people, not to get feedback on whether or not they tasted right, so to speak, or even good. And when I went back to cocktail bartending, it was a fascinating opportunity to really pay attention to the ingredients that I was using. And for me, in large part, these types of attitudes were informed partially by my upbringing, but also a long 10-year stint as an Uber volunteer for a nonprofit organization called Slow Food. And in the States, we call it Slow Food USA. It exists in Great Britain and around Europe and other parts of the world, of course. But that's what really keyed me in on what, if anything, might be considered authentic American gastronomy. So many cultures that I had started to experience from a European standpoint, a Central and South American standpoint, even a North African standpoint. In my limited experience at the time, you could quickly discern what their gastronomic heritage was. And I felt, for all the ups and downs, when you put the mirror in front of us as Americans, do we have anything contributable to a gastronomic sensibility? And to me, there's 2 things, only 2 things. The first and foremost is barbecue of the American South. and the other is cocktails. And we don't have ownership of cocktails, but obviously in the history of the development of cocktails, the creation, implementation, marketing, etc., a lot of that history takes place here. And I went off the deep end and really started involving myself as much as I could in 1999, 2000, 2001. And I often tell the story that at the end of 1999, New Year's Eve going into 2000, there were the sum total of 4 cocktail bars in New York City. Angel Share, a Japanese-influenced cocktail bar in the East Village. Passerby, which no longer exists, but was owned by the great cocktail bar impresario Toby Cecchini, inventor of the Cosmopolitan, now owner of Long Island Bar here in Brooklyn. A great, great cocktail bar that opened that New Year's Eve called Milk and Honey. Many will be familiar with the London edition. Milk and Honey on Eldridge Street on the Lower East Side here in New York City. Doesn't exist, but in that same space are disciples of Sasha Petrosky, the great influential American bartender who opened Milk and Honey that late 1999. And some of his disciples opened Attaboy in the same space on Eldridge Street today. And then there was the Rainbow Room, helmed by and influenced by Dale DeGroff. And that was it. And I was lucky enough to live in the East Village, and 3 of those bars were easy access, reasonably affordable for a once-a-week visit. And these influences washed over me as if to say something key is coming along here that might just be very exciting. And for me, it wholeheartedly was, because it combined my interest in culture, history, hospitality, and as I got into distilling, manufacturing, and learning the history of American rye whiskey and its roots in many cases to my home state of Maryland, near Washington, D.C., really comprised an outlook for me as I was looking to create an independent business around distilling. I said, now that would be something interesting. If I could not only celebrate, but help rejuvenate, in many ways, the lost cause of American rye whiskey, that would be something I would be very keen to pursue in an ambitious way, I would say most significantly in a very patient way, but also a very purposeful way to say, above all else, the decision that my partners and I made at New York Distilling Company was that no matter what, we would make, age, blend, and bottle our own whiskey. And those were the really beginnings of interest for me in creating what became and has become Ragtime Rye.
Fantastic. Well, you talk with great passion, Alan. It's great to hear. Obviously, we've had a lot of UK producers on the festival in a box, so it's really good to hear the perspective from across the pond. And it sounds like you've come from it from a slightly different angle to maybe to traditional Scottish distillers and distillers of Scotch style whiskies, in that you've come through from the passion for cocktails, and then the main ingredient in that cocktail being the rye whiskey, I guess.
Well, for me, I'd have to be honest, it was dumb luck. I was an early celebrant of what became the speakeasy cocktail culture of New York City. And I was working in a related part of the industry, what would easily enough be called consulting on brands. I was hired to do some focus groups and look at some marketing initiatives and consult on some product development. And what it turned into in very rapid succession over about a 3-year period was the opportunity on someone else's dime or pound or other currency to visit distilleries in the US, in the UK, in France, in Mexico, and other places. And I had never been to any distilleries at the time. This was 2002, 2003, 2004. And significantly for me, it was none other than a visit, my first of several visits to Plymouth, that stunned me into submission.
Hmm.
Literally. I could get very emotional, tearful even, in reminiscing about it. Because go to the pastoral setting of the Highlands or Isla. The one place I haven't been that I would love to go in this lifetime, frankly, is Orkney. But I've seen many pictures. Or to go to Cognac or Armagnac or Jalisco. And they're all very beautiful in a pastoral sensibility. I'm a New Yorker. I live in the city. And to be taken from the train station to the Plymouth Gin Distillery was, pardon my language, holy shit. An urban distillery. And now in the advent of quote unquote craft distilling, there are distilleries in New York and San Francisco and City of London and all over, of course.
Right.
But 20 plus years ago, to see that in effect was the light bulb, the lightning bolt that said, now that could be interesting. I don't have to go to the countryside and do what I think might be a great passion project. And it was at that moment that I really stopped doodling so much, which I'm good at, in a daydreamer's way, and starting putting down the practicals of what do I know and what don't I know that will suffice to try and get this type of business off the ground.
Fantastic. Well, we definitely want to hear more, but why don't we start tasting whiskey if you haven't already?
I poured myself a.
So we have the Ragtime straight whiskey. So tell us if you wouldn't mind, tell us a bit about the whiskey we're about to taste.
It's my pleasure. So, the fun of this is recounting the story in whole. I'll be relatively brief, but the truth is, before we harvested one grain, we thought we'll make a 2-year in the U.S. that would be called straight rye whiskey. There were very few. 1 rye whiskeys: Rittenhouse, Old Overholt, Sazerac, Jim Beam. That was really it in terms of the rye whiskey landscape that existed at that moment in time. And it was important. Our name is the New York Distilling Company, not brand XYZ company. We're purposefully distillers. And as I said at the outset, we were determined that we would make our own whiskey and age it. That even if it took a few years to get underfoot, that we wanted to make that commitment. I'm not saying it was the right decision. We could have, in fact, purchased whiskey, as many people do. There's nothing illegal about it. And many of the people that make contract whiskey make beautiful whiskey. We could have purchased whiskey, slapped a Ragtime label on it and said, here you go, it's Ragtime Rye, and we're making whiskey and we'll get to it as ours develops and ages, etc. Perhaps stubbornly, but as I said, very passionately, we wanted to be part of every inch of the process. We are not farmers. We do work with one specific farmer, Rick Peterson, in what is the Finger Lakes region of New York State. It's a nearly 6-hour drive from New York City, closer to the Canadian border than it is to here. And Rick, from the start, has grown all of our rye for us. And as I said, we thought we'd have a 2-year rye and get on the map as part of the new wave of not just celebrating American rye whiskey, but creating a connection to this gastronomic heritage of American cocktail culture, of Manhattans and Old Fashions and Sazeracs, etc. And very honestly, at 2 years, it wasn't terrible, but I'd have to be honest, it wasn't that good either. And just like, this is not what we want to be known for at the outset here, our first release of Ragtime Rye. So we let it age for another year. We thought, well, we're just going to defer. We're not losing any money. We'll defer that revenue for a year. And again, nothing wrong with being perfectly honest with you, Eddie. At 3 years old, we had to release it. We needed to get a return on some of that initial investment. And I liked very much more where it was tasting. But I knew it wasn't done. What you and I are tasting together is what has resoundingly become Ragtime Rye of the last 4 or 5 years. This is a blend, a concerted blend of 3 minimum, 3, 4, 5, and 6-year-old rye whiskeys. And we're able to cherry pick now out of a collection of several thousand barrels, and we only use what we would reasonably call full-size barrels, 53-gallon barrels, 200, 205-liter barrels at char number 3. We only use full-size barrels so that at 3 or 4 years, we've already lost 20% to absorption and evaporation. And for us, it's that mingling of oxygen in the barrel, in the summer seasons in particular, that are getting us to a point of what I like to say is whiskey that tastes of more than just wood. It's very trendy to have a craft distillery. I'm glad we do. I'm ready to give a hug and a kiss to anyone that makes their own whiskey. It is a labor of love that should be taken on, and I'm glad we do it. But for us, it was very obvious at the earliest set that younger whiskey wasn't going to cut it to our palate, and whiskey aged in smaller barrels in our climate also was not going to have the result, the net effect of getting past the overt oak and cedar qualities that come out of very young American whiskey.
So in terms of drinking rye, I mean, since the pandemic started, actually, I've drank probably more than my fair share of rye and bourbon because I love old fashions and I love Manhattans. I've really not branched out beyond there because I haven't felt the need to. But rye whiskey is not something, and even bourbon, it strikes me as they're whiskeys that are not often seen to be drank as neat as we would maybe single malt Scotch whiskey or other Scotch style whiskies from around the world. So do you like to drink it neat, or would you always prefer to drink it with ice or with
The pleasure for us as the distillers and the blenders and the bottlers is that the Ragtime we're tasting today is bottled at 90.4 proof at 45.2 ABV. I'm very content to drink this with an ice cube. I don't personally think it needs much more than that, but it should be enjoyed however someone likes it best. I typically do use this for cocktails, but the pleasure we have is a few marks at different proofs. Our higher proof, our bottled and bond at 100 proof, our cask strength at 112, I will often drink neat or with just a little bit of water. But that's the pleasure of having several to not just play with, but to near continuously evaluate on a, practically speaking, weekly basis.
Yeah. I think my challenge many years ago was that I was a real, and you'll hate me for this, but I was a real anti-cocktail.
Sure, I appreciate the honesty.
Because I was really tunnel visioned in my enjoyment of Scotch single malts and that kind of thing. Yeah. And to be fair, to this day I don't think that Scottish style whiskies work as well in cocktails as American whiskies or rye and bourbon style whiskies.
It depends, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, but I agree. The advent of a single malt perspective, or at our micro level, I mean, to give you a little more detail, the blend of Ragtime Rye that you're drinking is 13 or 14 barrels. This is not 100 barrels or 5,000 barrels. It's fun. I don't want to say it's painstaking. It's fun. We start with a set of 30 to 32 barrel samples and winnow that down to the finished blend of, as I said, 13 or 14. I think once we've had a blend of 15, so that we can really nuance the flavor profile to our palate, to our liking. And for that reason, I would say, yes, it can absolutely be consumed on its own, because if I just take the simplicity of more than just wood, well, you might want to know more about the grain or the mash bill, how much rye. It's 75% rye, 13% corn, 12% malted barley. So we're trying to be very forward on this New York rye or empire rye concept, but not completely hit you over the head with what can be a profoundly punchy, unctuously spicy grain at 95% or 100% rye. Then I think we're starting to treat things a little differently with barrel usage, time in the barrel, etc. But we're looking for some breadth of versatility. And when you make your own whiskey from scratch, you do have to give yourself the arc, the runway, if you will, to say, it's going to be a long time that I'm learning about these things. Every week that we taste, we're learning something about the whiskey that we put down 8-9 years ago.
That's yes, it's fascinating. It really is. And I think, are you able to pinpoint any particular differences in the way you guys do things at NYDC, versus perhaps larger distilleries? Because you're quite unusual in producing rye whiskey. Most would either go for a bourbon style or a even single malt these days.
Yeah, we only make rye whiskey from day one. That's the only whiskey we make. And part of that is to breed into this sensibility of American history that goes back easily to the 18th century. For example, we use at this point a primary grain called Horton rye, and Horton was the family breed of a rye that was ultimately developed by an English family, the Horton family, who came to New York, just north of New York City, from Leicester, England, likely in the 17th century. And they were integrated farmers and had a series of farms from, again, areas that are 25 minutes from the center of Manhattan all the way out to the end of Long Island that's front facing to the Atlantic Ocean. And we were very fortunate with an agricultural school here through Cornell University to identify Horton as a rye of significant New York State geographic heritage. And so we were gifted 10 seeds. 10. So differences between a little distillery and a large distillery. We said, okay, let's take 10 seeds. This is 11 years ago, before we were even incorporated as an actual business. And to make a long story somewhat shorter, it took years just to continually rotate and cultivate this original set of 10 seeds to have enough of a crop to start actually harvesting, milling, and distilling. At our small scale, we need about 1 million seeds per acre. And at this point, we have under reasonably perpetual rotation, a few hundred acres of rye that are grown for us every year. We use what's called winter rye. It's planted after the first frost in the harvest. It develops under typically snowpack over the winter in upstate New York. And when all that snow melts and the water helps feed the nutrients in the soil, it grows with a nice rapidity, so that by really this time of year, as we approach late June, early July, it is primed for harvest. And then once it's harvested, cleaned, dried, milled, it's early autumn before we're really set to start distilling it. But the opportunity to look into heirloom grains is something of particular interest on our end from a behind-the-scenes standpoint. And then, as I was describing, the effort to learn about our barrels all the while and to have a library, if you will, of a few thousand barrels now that showcase, what are the interesting flavors from age to age, from different points of what are now in three different sizes. I'll call them rec houses. One I would call an authentic rec house. One is across from me through a bay window in our distillery where we have 100 barrels aging. But we have 3 points, close, medium, and far geographically in New York State. That will be an entirely additional experiment to see how aging differs the end result of our whiskey over time. Yeah.
Well, actually, I was going to ask you next, Alan, is what does the future hold for NYDC? What is there? Have you got any particular ambitions beyond what you currently do? Are there any further innovations, product lines, that kind of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one that's sort of been lurking in the back burner for a couple of years now is a real effort to focus near singularly on the Horton variety of rye. And we, along with several other distilleries in New York State who make a myriad of whiskeys, helped create an endeavor that we call Empire Rye. New York is known as the Empire State. And we created this designation in collaboration with these other distilleries to further differentiate rye whiskey made, aged, bottled in New York State. Time will tell, and it's going to take some time, if there is a specific profile that may or may not be discernible from ryes from New York State. But we do think of this as a DOC, if you will, that will be a very specific moniker for ryes like ours that are made here. And for us, the Horton variety really is what plays into that most strenuously. We do not own Horton rye. Anyone else could go start, if they so chose, to go get 10 seeds from the seed bank. But that's it. And if you want to go commit to the next decade, you too can have a crop worthwhile to make your own version of this whiskey. But we're getting closer to starting to release this in a public way that we're really, really excited about. That very well may be the way we've been talking about single malt whiskey in a classification that I would put in its own category to say, yes, taste this on its own. Taste this at cask strength and taste what is an authentic retrospective to a rye whiskey easily from 18th century New York that we're excited to help recreate and share with a whiskey drinking public.
So are you able to estimate how many seeds you have from those 10 original seeds now, 10 years?
Well, millions. I wouldn't know how many millions, but tens of millions that were begat in the family tree of those original 10 seeds. We always joked as bartenders and waiters back in the day, we used to get paid out, in New York and our country in tips and gratuities, and you'd get your cash tips in a little manila envelope after the shift. That's what we got of 10 seeds of Horton rye, born of 18th century, perhaps even late 17th century New York.
Amazing. Maybe seeds was the wrong unit to use. Maybe I should have said acres.
But that's what we're excited about, heirloom varieties, and really continuing to put a very specific stamp via mash bill. And it's a word, I used it briefly in our conversation, but that I never did in our origins. But as I said, we're very prideful. We're a New York distilling company. But a word I would take equal pride in, and it's very much a team effort with our distillery crew, very talented group of people, and that's blending. Because it's not haphazard. It's not, hey, take those 10 barrels and dump them. That'll be Ragtime Rye. It is really a concerted tasting process that winnows down a focused selection, as I said, for a very purposeful finished outcome on Ragtime Rye.
Yeah, I mean, to make good stuff, you need good people, right? That's fantastic. Now, just before we finish, because we're actually nearing the end of the recording, I'm very curious because obviously, you come from the obviously from New York and you know, the New York distilling side of things, but interested to hear how, you know, what turns you on globally in the whiskey market. You know, are there things happening elsewhere in the world that excite you or concern you even?
Well, I can't say that it concerns me. As I said, I'm very prideful for the fact that we make our whiskey and always have from day one. And so I legitimately applaud anyone that makes whiskey from scratch commercially. You know, the things that excite me that hit close to home in an impassioned way are the rye whiskeys that are coming from different parts of the world. And it's fun to learn about different varieties. I'm very familiar with a German variety of rye called Brasetto. And we've seen that be reintroduced in Germany, and then other varieties like it in the UK. Obviously, there are homegrown varieties of rye coming out of Scandinavia that are very exciting. And so that people have different perspectives, that it's not just this static universe of, well, we made something so that it would taste or mimic something else that people are already familiar with. That the level of creativity in a global scale, including Australia, New Zealand, climates that are so varied that I would have no sensibility about. Now, I'm keyed into our climate on the eastern seaboard of the US. And I'm familiar, obviously, with climates from Texas to Oregon and Washington and California. And I know the climates well enough, whether it's in England or Scotland or Wales, from an influential standpoint and how it might help the result of a finished whiskey. But when we start talking about really cold temperatures in Scandinavia or really hot temperatures in Australia, those really get my juices flowing to say I'm excited to learn more about what the global whiskey community is doing, and that it's continually evolving because there's interest in taking it into new places.
Indeed. Well, actually, as you mentioned, we had a second rye whiskey in the Festival in a Box 2.0 from Denmark, Stauning Rye. Have you heard of those guys?
Yes.
Fantastic stuff also. But yeah, I love the fact that rye whiskey is having a resurgence, not just in the USA, but, you know, all over the world. And, you know, particularly in Scandinavia, like you say, in Germany.
I mean, it might be romantic on my part, but it's in our lifespan as a business. And it continues to be the case that most rye, certainly in our country, is grown solely as a cover crop. It's very nutrient rich. It holds soil well to help prevent erosion. But usually it comes to harvest time and it's plowed under. Wow. So to return to some sense of heritage, but also try and focus on making the absolute best whiskey that we can, is very pleasing to say, not only are we doing that, but we're actually paying a farmer to grow grains for us that he and his family would otherwise just plow into the earth.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, all power to you for taking that crop and making good stuff with it. Alan, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. And to be honest, you know, I'd love to talk to you for a lot longer, but needs must. But hopefully in the future we can get together and share a whiskey or two, or a beer or two, or a cocktail or two, or all of the above.
I'll take all of the above.
Yes. Alan, thank you so much for coming on. It's a real pleasure to talk to you. Really appreciate the time you've taken to come on, and thank you for the Ragtime Rye as well. So cheers to you.
Cheers indeed. Thank you.
Thank you.